The Speaking of Cults podcast is presented solely for general informational, educational, and entertainment purposes. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from it is at the user's own risk. The views, information, or opinions expressed by the host and guests are solely those of the individuals involved and do not constitute medical or other professional advice. Hello and welcome to the Speaking of Cults podcast. As you can see, I am joined this week by Dr. Clint Heacock, and we are going to get right into it, but I do need to do a little bit of setup here, and that is that we are talking this week because Clint has just recently published a book, an autobiography, a story of his story, and it's really good. I'm going to just totally blow your ears out with that because it's really good. I have
appreciate that.
found it to be a page turner. I really was like, what's happening next and next and next. And I found it to be full of, even for me, somebody who's been exploring cults and the evangelical cult world as part of my recovery process and education process of leaving Scientology. I've connected with so many people over the years like Clint who have stories of their own to tell, just like I have my own one. And we find all these common points, these points of common ground and common experience because we were in cults, and cults do things that are very similar one to the next. But some of the specific, unique attributes of Clint's upbringing and the evangelical world are both, I don't know, it's fascinating, but horrifying. And so Clint's book goes into all the details of this with his upbringing. So, all right. So with all of that, Clint, welcome back to my show.
Thank you, Chris. I was just going to say, I really appreciate the introduction. And just from my point of view, meeting you, I don't know how many years it's been, probably 7, 8 years.
Yeah, something.
I think we connected each other years ago. That was a huge breakthrough for me because that's when I realized, and speaking to you as a former Scientologist, me as a former evangelical, and I've said this before, how similar our experiences were. And I thought to myself, this can't be true, but it is, and that's really one of the big turning points in my life, the reconstruction of my life as an ex-evangelical, because I realized what I need to start doing is educating myself on how cults operate. And that's what I've been doing for the last, how many years, almost 10 years now. And you've been a big part of that. So I really appreciate that. And I do that in the book where there's something that comes along and I'll say, by the way, this is what cults do. So I try to ground the reader and orient the reader like, this is what's happening to me. If you can't figure it out yourself.
Yeah, it's really good. And you definitely do drop references to, Steve Hassan and the Bite model and Janja Lalich and bounded choice and these various ways we have of looking at these things. So it's really educational while you're going along too. And it's subtle. And that's one of the things that I really liked about the way you put your book together. You had a wonderful chapter on Bill Gothard's 7 biblical principles and relating that to a cult model, because Bill Gothard is pretty goddamn culty, if we're going to be honest. Today.
Let's be honest.
The man preached a very hypocritical dogma. He didn't even, walk the walk or live the life that he preached, and like with all cult leaders. But it's the thing that really gets me going. And I'll just lead with this today because we're going to talk an awful lot about this today. Is the child abuse is what's done with kids, and the familial abuse. If we're really being like, let's call a spade here. It's not just about the kids. The entire family dynamic is turned on its head and upside down and backwards. And then they have the nerve to say, this is the idealized Christian family, is this hellhole torture pit, sort of monster factory where black is white and up is down, and everything that is good about child rearing and about creating independent, critically thinking human beings, that's all bad. We can't have any of that. We can only have all this stuff that turns you into a little automaton for Christ. And I don't mean to be disrespectful of people's beliefs when I say stuff like that, but I have to be a bit snarky because your experiences, my experience, the experiences in this activity of growing up in a cult is pretty nasty. I guess I wanted to start with, rather than sort of re-walking through your whole story, I want to say, read the book. I
Simple
really want to
explanation.
encourage everybody out there. We're not going to go through a whole summary here today of Clint's book. Instead, I wanted to ask you about a couple specific things that you brought up in the book. And I actually even brought notes, which is
I'm
unusual
impressed.
for me today.
It really is. Yeah. I've sent you stuff before and we've gone through it. So we did Project 2025 not long ago. That was really enjoyable.
Yeah,
I've really enjoyed the comments because I went back and looked at that on your YouTube channel and I thought there's a lot of really good feedback as the viewers, listeners were interacting with what we were saying. So yeah, I really enjoyed that collaboration.
absolutely. Yeah, me too. Me too.
Mm,
And by the way, Project 2025 is still out there right now, folks. And it's still on the
mhm.
and it hasn't gone away. They're just
Nope.
being super, super quiet about it because they don't want, and this is actually, in a way, representative of the entire culture. Is they have ideals and goals, but they don't want people knowing about it. They just want to push it and force it and dominate people into complying with it.
Hmm.
And it's pretty nasty stuff because it really violates human rights. And I wanted to start with sort of the reverse psychology of forbidding things to your kids. And so they get it anyway. And you described this so well, right? You have all these rules and all these things, but you and your friends are tearing around, breaking all the rules. Your sister and sisters and you are listening to the rock music on the radio when the parents aren't home, and all this. It doesn't work. It's not like the kids are really being good, and it instills a kind of family dynamic of secrets and guilt over forbidden knowledge and sin. And it demonstrates that the parents are liars for telling the kids that stuff is, quote, harmful. And it kind of seems to me that it would weaken the faith in the religious beliefs if you're constantly being told something that you can see in which you show yourself isn't true. And what I'm saying at all resonating with your childhood and how you grew up with all of that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is, and going back to Hassan's bite model, behavior control, information control. That's the big one, isn't it? You
Yeah.
deny these kids. In our case, there were 6 of us kids growing up in this household near the Seattle, Washington area, about 30 minutes south of Seattle. And my parents tried, and they did. They succeeded in a lot of ways, as you say, in controlling our information flow. So we didn't have a television in the house. We had a radio, but we could only listen to Christian music, approved records that my dad had. And yet every chance we got, like you say, we would, when my mom was running errands, we'd rush to the radio, crank it to the rock station, KJR in Seattle. I remember that station, we knew where that one was, and we'd run all over the house. But the flip side was if we got caught or she suspected we'd been messing with, we'd get a spanking. So there was corporal punishment. It was a very dangerous game. It wasn't like we'd just get told off or something. Their solution to every sort of misbehavior, quote unquote, was spanking, corporal punishment. And that was, again, part of the Bill Gothard. Another name is Dr. James Dobson, focus on the family, similar kind of thing. That my parents not only raised us kids according to their teachings, but they patterned their marriage after it as well, sort of a deeply patriarchal system. And as I see it now, as you read the book, you'll see it in many ways, it destroyed my family and my parents' marriage. So it's deeply, toxic and damaging.
Very, very much so. You mentioned Dobson. I also think of Michael Pearl.
Hmm.
Wrote a book, How to Train Up a Child, and I read that book, and I didn't read Dobson, but Pearl's philosophy, and this was also going hand in hand with Gothard's, and is part of Gothard's culture, is that the spirit and attitude of the work is child rearing is a matter of breaking the child's spirit. And you specified in the book that Dobson wasn't about necessarily breaking the child, and yet for all practical intents and purposes the actions taken against the children are the same. You're beating
Still getting
them
spanked.
to submission, right?
Yeah. I didn't see the difference as a kid when I was 10, 11, 12, getting spanked. My mom could have said, now Dobson actually doesn't, gone in. Who cares? I'm getting my ass beat. The bottom
Right.
line is it's gonna hurt like hell and I'm gonna cry. And that was the thing, Gothard in particular said that you knew as a parent, you knew when you'd broken the will of the child when the child starts to cry. And that was the point you had to reach as a parent. You just keep spanking until the child cries, and then you've broken their will. And it was all about stopping their proclivity to sin. That was the whole thing, is they were saying, well, because in Christian theology we're born with, quote, original sin inherited from Adam and Eve in the garden. Every human being is born with an innate nature. We are bent to sin. That's what we just do. And that's what Christian theology in the main teaches. So their attitude was, no, we've got to stop that child from, going toward his or her natural proclivity to sin. And that's what the Bible teaches: spare the rod, spoil the child, and all this kind of stuff. So they had biblical precedent for it. It wasn't just Bill Gothard and Dobson. It was the Bible taught, you spare the rod, spoil the child. The parent actually hates his or her child if they withhold discipline. And God himself is seen, it says in the many places in the New Testament, God is like the loving father. He disciplines his children for their own good, even if we don't understand why he's doing it at the time. So their view of God is literally as a disciplining parent. So it comes right the way down from their model of God through the Bible, through the teachings of guys like Gothard and Dobson and many others, Pearls, and that's how we were raised.
It strikes me that this is very much a fire and brimstone attitude in the spirit of Jonathan Edwards, sinners in the hands of an angry God. That sermon has always been in the back of my mind because we studied it as literature.
Why not? Actually, it is an important, thing to study. I studied it for my doctorate. Yeah.
Yeah,
it's a unique period in time where he's starting the Great Awakening, and he's frightening people into, complacent people into, giving their lives over to God. And the best way he could do that was to preach this horrifying terror sermon, and that's what he did.
What is up with that? It seems to be a centuries-old theme.
It is. I mean, the quick version of it was that Jonathan Edwards was living in the context in 18th century colonial America, which was still part of the British Empire at that point. They were loyal British citizens. People were raised in with Christian values and everything else. So he was trying to get through to his people. They'd heard the salvation message thousands of times before. So the best way to do it was this sort of new genre, the terror sermon. And it did. It had an intent. People were throwing themselves on the floor, weeping and wailing and crying out and gnashing their teeth and all that. And that helped to start the Great Awakening, which was a huge revival. So he did have a, quote, breakthrough. So that's a kind of a whole nother thing. But American evangelicalism builds on that sort of legacy of the revivalism. That's been a major part all the way through Billy Sunday, Billy Graham, Charles Finney. I mean, so many famous revivalist preachers throughout the couple of centuries, and that's the legacy of guys like Jonathan Edwards.
I would be very interested sometime in doing a compare and contrast with you about, this might surprise you, about Est, Warren Earhart, right? And the way he would control a room of people in the 70s and 80s when he was coming up developing his shtick with Eston Landmark was remarkably similar to the kind of fire and brimstone and what I'll say is it's rhetoric delivered at high volume to make an impact on a group of people. It's not meant to be a one-on-one thing. It's a tough love approach of, you guys are, basically, to be crude, you guys are messing up. You're fucking up. Your entire lives are being ruined because of your inequities, because of your stupidities, your ignorances, your lies that you tell yourself. It's really getting in and like brutal honesty, so to speak, right? And it's an awful lot like the revivalist movement was built on the same kind of psychological button pushing of, you're weak, you are not honest and integral and true and living by the commandments and this sort of thing, or living by the rules you should be living with, you're an immoral person. And so by sticking your head in the mud we're somehow going to create, make you into a great person. And I've found this to be a very workable technique. Were there are there lots of examples in this evangelical world of this being leading people to a good life? Because you describe it as sort of a setup for the most hypocritical life, where you have to present as though everything's great, but the reality is it's hell on wheels behind closed doors.
You've got to look the part, play the part, speak the part, act the part. But in reality, and this was I was always conflicted, and I come back to this theme, I think, a lot in the book, where as a kid growing up and even as an adult, feeling that sense that I've got to act a certain way in front of certain people, and then in front of other people, act a different way. And that shouldn't be right. I should be the same person all the time. And this is a big thing in evangelical circles, this idea of, they say you got to remove the mask, take off the mask and be your true self in church. But the fact is, most churches that I was ever a part of, you couldn't afford to take off your mask, in air quotes, and be authentic, because most Christians, I found when I was a pastor, I was a pastor for 12 years in Portland, people struggle with serious stuff. I mean, mental health is one thing, but I mean, secret affairs, addictions, all sorts of stuff. And they could never confess those things for fear of being judged, booted out of the church and all that. So the end result is you've got to wear the mask. You've got to look pious and sound spiritual, because that's what everyone else is doing around you, and that's a classic cult thing, is socialization. And you look around the group and you're like, okay, what are other people saying? What are they doing? And you just start to act the same after a while, and you're socialized. It's normalized.
There was something you said there that I think is a real anchor to that whole problem, and that is that you're not somehow allowed to confess or be honest or open about your sinful nature, because it's so important that you present as this sinless person.
Yeah.
Does it not seem like that is a kind of double bind, a kind of like stuck place where you can't give up the goods about what makes you bad, because you have to pretend you're always good?
Yeah, it's really conflicted.
And it keeps you in an evil place because you can't get it off your chest, right?
Yeah, and it's funny because I was thinking while you were saying that, when I was in Bible college in Portland, I used to go to these pastors' conferences. They used to hold them at Cannon Beach in Oregon, on the Oregon coast. And we would go along as Bible college students. And it was ironic that, there'd be like Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday night, and then everyone would leave the Sunday morning. Well, by the time Saturday night rolled around, they'd had speakers, and it was mystical manipulation, milieu control, all those kind of things. I would say now, worship, deep prayer sessions, and really getting everyone, fired up for God. But there'd be like a confession session on the Saturday evening, and all these pastors would filter their way up to the front, and they would confess to their fellow pastors, their grievous sins that they couldn't afford to talk about in their own home congregations. They could do it in a quote unquote safe place. And most of it had to do with, pornography addictions and things like that. A lot of pastors I've heard about were addicted to pornography, had this secret sin, quote unquote, and they couldn't confess it to their wife for sure. And they absolutely couldn't tell their church, hey, I'm addicted to pornography, I'm watching it online, blah, blah, blah. And it was that same exact bind, and the funny thing was, the other pastors would come up and lay their hands on them and pray for them that they'd be delivered of this sin, which was, it's magical thinking, of course, because I talk about it in the book. I was quote unquote addicted to pornography as a teenager. I prayed, I begged, I had other people praying for me thousands and thousands of times. Release me from this addiction. Never happened. Why not? Why? It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. It's not a magical thing where God just flips a switch and you're released, you're free. At least it never worked that way for me.
Yep, exactly. That was a very telling moment when you wrote about that, the fact that if all of this, you didn't say it this way, but basically, if all of this worked, there really wouldn't be so much of a problem. I mean, because all of this sacrifice and abuse would have a result. There'd be some positive outcome. You'd be like, I have to go through all this bullshit, but look, I'm sin free. I'm guilt free. I feel saved, salvaged.
Yeah.
I'm able to live a moral life. I mean, if you could have that result, maybe some of this shit would be worth it. But the fact
Yep.
of the matter is, it's not. And spank. Let's go back to the spankings thing for a second.
Mm,
I got to go back to this because there are so many points of hypocrisy here. Spankings don't work.
yeah.
Your parents were doing it. You described a 3 or 4 year period where it was multiple times a day. This was not
Yeah.
a weekly, once a week, once a month occurrence in your household. You had 5 siblings and you all being beaten on routinely, and
Hmm.
again, for a period of time, multiple times a day. Your parents knew it didn't stop the bad behavior. It didn't drive the sin from you, but they kept doing it anyway. And
Mhm.
something you mentioned earlier, they didn't know what else to do. I'm thinking you have all these books and sermons and cultural advice from the community telling you, well, if it doesn't work, you're not doing it hard enough.
Yeah.
So let's just keep doing it, right?
Never gonna give ground, not an inch, not a millimeter, and nothing.
Right? It smacks of such desperation,
Yeah.
and yet it's just pure child abuse, right? And they know over time that this is a completely useless activity. It's not having any result in terms of bringing discipline or order to the house. So, could you describe for me and for the audience what effect did it have? If it
Yeah,
didn't
certainly.
solve the problem,
Yeah.
what did it do?
Yeah, exactly. That's the whole point, isn't it? Not only did it not solve the actual problem they were trying to quote correct, which was our sinful behavior. And my girlfriend, she says, how sinful was it? Were you just being normal kids? Because as you said before, we were acting out because it was such a repressive and strict environment. So listening to rock music because it was denied and forbidden, therefore more attractive, led to a spanking. You're not going to do that again because the deterrent is so high, but it didn't work. As you say, we got spanked hundreds, thousands of times, and it didn't work. But what it did do is it created, well, it's a physical abuse. You're getting spanked with a stick. It hurts. It's physically bruising and painful. It also is emotionally damaging because you're being beaten and you're told, you're wayward child. You're acting out. You're being naughty and wrong. And the other thing is, it's a spiritual abuse as well because we were told the reason we're doing this is that God Himself commands us to do this. This is what the Bible says. This is what God says to do for children. Loving, godly parents spank their children to correct their wayward sinfulness. So, growing up, I always struggled to manufacture a love for God, quote unquote. I was told as a kid after I got baptized the first time when I was 10, okay, you need to start reading your Bible every day. You need to pray every day. And you need to develop a love for God, this invisible silent being that I never saw or could have a conversation like we're having now. What does that mean? Yet this is the same God who's commanding my parents to spank and abuse us. How do you love that? So it's another, conflicting issue as well.
Great point. Really good point. You mentioned a few times in growing up. Well, I just wanted to ask it. I wanted to ask this way. Do you think that this idea, quote, Jesus is truly seated on the throne of my heart, this
Yeah.
phrase, right? Is this used as a thought stopping cliche?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I wouldn't have seen it that way as a child. And this
Yeah.
ended up getting cut out of the book. But when I was in Bible college and seminary, I found out that's an actual strain of theology that comes from, I'm in the UK. It comes from this place called Keswick, which is up in, if you know the UK, it's in what's called the Lake District. It's north of England. And it was a holiness movement in the Victorian era in the 19th century that eventually filtered its way across the pond. And by the time it got to America, it infused the Church of Christ, which is what I was raised in. That was the denomination I was raised in. So I was raised with this Keswick theology. I never even knew what this was. I didn't know I'd never heard of Keswick. I'd never heard of the theology. I couldn't have pointed it out on a map. If you'd asked me, where is Keswick? What's that? I don't know. I only found out decades later. And that was the thinking, was they pushed this idea that it's no good for you to have Jesus as your savior, but not accept him as your Lord. if you don't have him, quote unquote, seated on the throne of your heart, meaning he's your king, as well as saving you from hell, he's going to let you go to heaven, but you have to obey him as well as your king. As a citizen of heaven, the citizens obey their king, and Jesus is your king. And that's the whole thinking behind it. That's where the holiness aspect of it comes in, because they're saying you've got to live your life in such a way that's set apart from the evil world, that shows you are a definite Christian, which is something I always struggle with. But I didn't even know the theology that I'd been exposed to till decades later. And I heard my professor talking about Keswick theology in class one day, and I was like, what? This is the theology I was raised with. What? I've never heard of this in my life until I'm in my mid-20s. And I'm like shocked. Never heard of it. And the penny dropped at that point.
How did that education at seminary or at your schooling, how did that open your eyes to some of the problems with your upbringing, with your very heavily religious upbringing? In case we haven't gotten it clear yet, folks.
Pretty messed up.
Very heavily religious upbringing.
Yeah, so, fundamentalist, really.
Very fundamentalist. Yeah, evangelical to the core. And you ended up going to school, pursuing becoming a pastor, getting a doctorate in this. And this is one of the reasons that I love talking with you, is because I wanted to ask you, how did that education affect your view of your childhood, first off?
Oh, massively. Like my example of the Keswick theology, when I got to Bible college in 1993 down in Portland, Oregon, that was the first time I'd been exposed to alternative traditions, which I found out, there's hundreds, thousands of different Christian traditions for millennia, and so when I started reading church history, the stuff that went on in the past, the Reformation and the medieval time, I'm like, there's this whole world of people out there who have taught and lived their whole lives with a completely different, and I mean completely different worldview, theology than me. And that's what really kind of, as I say it now, ironically, it was one small step toward deconstruction, because I was quite angry that this stuff had been withheld from me. Because I talk about in the book, I was raised in this Christian bubble. So back to that information control, the things that terrified me as a kid was just one possible theological explanation for this particular biblical passage. When I got to Bible college, they said, for example, write a paper on 4 different views of the end times, theological interpretations. And I studied, let's say, 4 completely different views and wrote a paper, 10-page paper. And it was like, wow, other Christians believe completely different things than I did. And I was quite angry that I had not been exposed to this. I was only told this is the truth, capital T, truth. It's the only way that we understand the Bible, period. So it was a huge formative thing for me, even though I'm not a Bible college teacher anymore, but it did shape me in a lot of ways.
Well, I found that quote to be very interesting. In fact, I even had written it down, right? It's not, I felt so angry that so much information had been withheld from me by people I trusted. And it occurred to me to ask you about this. Do you think, I said here, it's not the falsity of the beliefs you were raised with that's the problem so much as the fact you were denied any power of choice to decide for yourself what you wanted to believe. Do you agree with that statement as to like what the source of the betrayal might be, is the fact that we weren't given any choices?
Yeah, you're raised in that Christian bubble, and the things I was exposed to, and I talk about this, the book begins with this whole story about rapture anxiety, thinking that I came home as a 12-year-old kid to an empty house after soccer practice, terrified, literally in a panic state, thinking that Jesus has returned and every true believer has been snatched up to heaven, and I was clearly not a true believer and therefore had been left behind. And based on that kind of thinking, I lived my life for years and years and years in that sort of groove, that sort of cycle, thinking I must make sure that I am in fact a true believer, because if the rapture happens, I don't want to be left behind. And you looking at it objectively now, you think, God, that's really fucked up. That's really abusive for a kid. And yet everyone around me was normalized. Everyone believed the same things I did. My pastor said it, my parents said it. They showed movies in church. We saw it as a congregation. The books I read were all about, the late great planet Earth, Hal Lindsey. Jesus is coming soon. You've got to be ready, you know. And that's how we lived our, our lives. And it's really messed up. And it causes religious trauma syndrome. That's one of the big things.
Big time. There it is. That's
Yeah.
exactly right. Because this can really mess you up for life. That's why
Oh
I
yeah.
have such a big thing about it. I didn't know, I'd never heard of a thief in the night, right? I went and looked all that up, and you gave this whole down on it. And I actually went and found it and watched a
Yeah.
little
It's
bit of
on
it. Like,
YouTube.
damn,
You can watch it, the whole movie.
yeah, that is I mean,
Yeah.
and I had to comment on the fact that um I don't think my personal take on this, uh I don't think there should be any 12-year-old anywhere in the world, boy or girl, who comes home to an empty house and their first terrified thought and
Yeah.
emotional reaction is, I've been left behind. I mean, it was
What is
so
that?
indicative of the fear that dominated your life as a child.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
right?
That's the first place I went to. And yet I talk about I raced next door to my cousin's house and I knew they'd be home because they weren't Christians. They're sinful heathens, and I'm trying to make sure they're saved. I was always trying to evangelize my two cousins, but I'm thinking I know they're going to be home because they ain't Christians. So if anyone, I can watch the TV news and figure out if the rapture has indeed happened, and reflecting on it now, I think if they came home to an empty house, they'd be like, yes, party time. No one's here. Let's attack all the sweets in the cupboard and dig out all the stuff mom's hidden and trash the house and crank up the music. That's what they would have done. That's a normal kid. I, on the other
Exactly.
hand,
I
I
mean,
come home and panic. I mean, terrified isn't even the word for it. I was in such a state of panic. I was in tears. I was freaking out, running around the house trying to find a note. I mean, and I've heard other podcasts and I've talked to other people who were raised in that similar environment. This is a thing. This is absolutely a thing. There are tens of thousands, maybe millions of people just like me who suffered from rapture anxiety as evangelical. So this is not a unique thing. This is very, very common.
exactly.
Yeah.
And very, very awful to do to people.
Yeah.
There really is no good reason for this. But now, you being kind of a Bible expert now,
Hmm.
because of your
Ironically.
I know, right? And yet you do. I mean, it's a really interesting situation because you grow up in a fear-based terror household that is basically a little bit of a, well, I'm not going to put it that way. I'll just say it was really bad. And you're given a very clear, repetitive message by authority figures, your parents, and the community that you're in, that this is how it is. You then go to seminary, you then go learn and write papers and start dealing with this academically and really go deep. What's your take based on your now larger view and more embracive understanding of the Bible? What's your take on that little tiny world of interpretation of the Bible? How do you, like, how hard do they have to fight to keep themselves in that biblical interpretation?
Oh yeah, bigly, as Trump would say, and that's goes back to the whole where fundamentalism came from, where that movement came from, which
Tell
without
me.
getting too far into the weeds, but basically
Yeah.
around the end of the 19th century and up until about 1950, there was this movement in Christianity where a lot of the theology was going very liberal, thanks to German sort of higher criticism, and they kind of tore the Bible apart and showed really that it's actually not one book written by 66 different authors. Each book was written by that author. One single author wrote each book. No, multiple authors, multiple sources, and man, that just tore Christianity apart. And as a reaction to the liberal bent, there came fundamentalism, and that's where these fundamentals of the faith come from. It was a militant and reactionary movement against liberal theology. So that was the trend I was raised in. So ironically, even going to the Bible college and seminary that I went to in Portland, yes, I learned more and I studied, my horizons were indeed expanded, but even that Bible college, even that seminary was part of that fundamentalist tradition. The Bible college I went to in Portland was called Multnomah Bible College, and it was started by graduates of Dallas Theological Seminary, which is a fundamentalist Bible college in Texas. So they came from that tradition, and I could tell you story after story, even within the more broader setting of Multnomah and my seminary. There were clear lines you could not cross. I mean, I can remember very clearly one of my professors was teaching, quote, a liberal theology, teaching that women should be allowed in ministry. Ooh, that, I mean, and they convened a panel like the Spanish Inquisition. They hauled him up in front of students and faculty and basically roasted him over his liberal theology about allowing women in ministry and how that was wrong and incorrect and unbiblical and all the rest of it. So there were very clear lines within that world, and you could find yourself drummed out of a teaching position very, very quickly if you espouse, quote, liberal theology, like allowing women to preach or something like that. So even at Multnomah, it was, the lines were clear. So that's how they do it. They just say, well, if you're not going to agree. And I can remember when I was a student, when I started there, I had to sign a doctrinal statement, my agreement. They said, you cannot enroll at Multnomah without signing a doctrinal statement. You must agree to all these. There was about 10 or 12 points on this piece of paper. And when I started, I was like, yeah, I agree. No problem. Sign it. Boom, I'm in. When I graduated 4 years later, they said, you've got to sign it again. You have to say 4 years later, I still agree with everything that I signed 4 years ago. And I found that I couldn't. And there was a couple things I'm like, no, I now disagree with that. One of them was this end times theology. And they said, well, at the space below, you can write in why you disagree. And I did. I wrote this long, like the back of the page, why I disagree with this. And they let me graduate anyway. But that again shows how they want to control. They want to make sure where you're at when you start and when you finish, that you haven't really fundamentally altered your core beliefs. But I had, as part of this process.
Wow.
Crazy, isn't it? I mean, imagine going to a place where you have to sign
Yeah.
something when you start and when you finish that you haven't
Wow.
changed. That's madness.
No.
What university would do that? But here's a Bible college.
Wow. Well, that is not good. For obvious reasons. Lots of
Yeah.
social pressures there on display. And
Mm.
I guess I'm wondering, let me ask you this then. So now, having gone through that and your eyes start opening up to at least other choices and possibilities and interpretations, right?
Mm-hmm.
So even if they're trying to lock in your thinking and still bind your choices, at least you've got a little bit more freedom with that experience. Then post that, what happens when that brings you to the place where you realize this ain't what the Bible says? When does that happen? And how does that happen?
Yeah, it was a long process.
I'm
A
sure.
long process. It's not
There was
something
no
that
one
happened
moment.
overnight. Yeah, a lot of it was when I was a pastor. I was a pastor for 12 years in Portland, and part of that was when I was at Bible college, and then later while I was going through seminary, and I was an elder, and then I became a pastor of this church. And when I would preach, I didn't preach every Sunday, but I preached probably once every 6 weeks. As a teacher, that's how I'm wired. So when I would, let's say, approach a biblical passage, okay, you're going to preach on, Ephesians, whatever chapter you want to assign to me. That's your sermon for that week. I would really dig into it. I would go to the seminary library and I would look up every commentary that I could find. And there'd be, let's say 7, 8, 9, 10 commentaries from various different perspectives. And then when I preached that passage or that section from the Bible, I would give the listeners those options. I'd say, well, this isn't the only way to interpret this. There are at least, let's say, 3 possible views on how this should be understood. Now, a lot of people didn't like that because they would come up to me after the sermon. They would say, but what is it? Which one is it? Tell us which one's the right one. And I would say, that's not what I was trying to do. I was trying to get you to see that there are multiple possibilities with good validations for each one. In fact, there's more than that, but I didn't want to give you 10. I only gave you 3. you need to go do your research, do your home. And some people got really upset and went and complained, that he's not giving us the truth here. He's not, he's making us think. Well, that's not right. So it was things like that where I'd go, there can't be just one. And I was always taught growing up, there's one correct interpretation to every single Bible passage. That's just absolutely not true. It can't be true. Because if you look at church history, it's been understood in myriads of ways, and that's a proven fact. So that's what kind of opened my eyes to the fact that, whoa, other people in times past have not interpreted this the way I think it should be. Why is that? And that leads you down a rabbit trail.
What were your conversations with other pastors like in this faith around these kinds of things? Because clearly the education shows you these commentaries exist, these other
Yeah.
ways of thinking about
Oh, yeah.
this.
I'm not making it up.
Right.
Yeah, I can cite chapter and verse and give footnotes and all, and I'm writing academic papers and, speaking at conferences and all that.
So how do they resolve? Because I'm really curious about this. Like, I know how Scientologists do stuff, and I know how Mormons kind of think around things and stuff, right, and on certain stuff. But when it comes to evangelical pastors who have this one message, one right way, how do they tell themselves as educated pastors, well, these 9 commentaries by these guys are just bullshit, and I'm just taking this one, and
it's the truth.
how do they tell themselves that's how to do their job?
It's funny because, yeah, well, that's the way I was raised and taught well, like I said, when I went to Bible college, I went through what's called homiletics class, which is basically, homiletics means preaching, learning how to preach. And they would assign you a passage, and you'd preach a sermon in front of your fellow students, and it had to be timed, and you had to have everything, you hit all the points, and you get graded on this sermon. You preach 3 or 4 sermons throughout the term, and that's how they told me to preach. They said, look, you got 10 minutes to preach this sermon. You've got to get in and get out. You got to make your point, have one point. The sermon has to have one key, point, bullet point, and then back that up with scriptural evidence to prove that it's true, and then get out by applying whatever you just said to the lives of your listeners. That's how you classically preach a sermon, is you have a passage, you go through it, you prove that your interpretation is the correct one, and then you go, okay, now what does this mean to you and me? So I would say, Chris, what you need to start doing is X, Y, Z based on what I've just said the Bible teaches, and so that's how you do it. And I think a lot of pastors, I mean, I remember I was a youth pastor, and my pastor said to me one time, because he was a horrible preacher, it was just the worst sermons, like meandering, boring sermons. He said, normally I put my sermons together either Saturday night late or Sunday morning right before church. And that's pretty common. He would just throw something together an hour before the service started and wing it on a now that's not typical for every pastor, obviously, but I
Well,
was
his
shocked when
problem
I
was he
heard
wasn't
that.
very good at it.
Yeah, he was shit.
Like,
He
you
was
can get
really
away with
bad.
that, but if you're no good at it,
Yeah, he wasn't even that good.
this
Some
was
people get
Mark,
away with
right?
it. No, this was
Was
another
that
pastor that
another one?
yeah,
Okay.
but I think, a lot of pastors were, very significant, authority figures all through my life growing up. And I grew up listening to thousands and thousands of sermons. And there's one story I tell in the book where my friend, he was named Guy, and he was 14 years old. We met at high school, Christian high school. And the first time he came to my house, we took him to church on the Sunday morning. He stayed the weekend. And on the way back, we got into this huge, vicious argument. And the sermon that Sunday had been how the gift of tongues, is miraculous. Someone speaks in tongues and someone interprets the tongues. And this is charismatic sort of church, how that was completely unbiblical and wrong. And he gave all this evidence for why it's wrong and why it's, heretical, blah, blah, blah. And I agreed with everything the pastor said. Guy grew up in a charismatic church where they spoke in tongues, and there was all that. We got into this huge argument all the way home, 45-minute drive. And when we got home, he packed up all of his stuff and ducked out the back door and was going to walk home. It was a torrential rainstorm. And my dad finally went and figured out he was gone. He went and found him and took him back to the house. But that shows you how both of us were so indoctrinated, because that was our worldview. We fought to the death to prove, quote unquote, that our view, our interpretation was right. But that was the indoctrination we had received from a lifetime of listening to sermons like that.
Wow. Yeah. Why? Okay, here's a question for you. Why? It's a little long. Let me give this out here. Why do you think it is now? Why do you think it is now that the hardcore brand of Christians, such as what you were raised in, teach that even being Christian isn't good enough? You have to be righteous. I think you said the gem earning Christians, right?
Yeah, that's right. Got to earn your rewards.
That's right. Be rewarded with wealth for eternity. What is this all about? What is that supposed to actually look like in the real world? These so-called true Christians versus the rest of the more liberal Christians, who these preachers state unequivocally are just fakes and aren't going to get into heaven. What do you think that has anything to do with keeping the followers constantly doubting themselves so they won't pay too much attention to anything else? Is it like this big fear thing, or what's the purpose of this? There's true Christians like us, and then there's those liberal fake Christians. Why go us versus them on Christians?
It's funny because there's a lot of the biblical precedent for that, and I was raised again with that theology. I mean, Jesus in the Gospels, there's a parable. It's attributed to Jesus, and he's called the wheat and the weeds. And basically, he tells this parable, and he says, "Okay, a farmer went out and sowed his crops, a field of wheat, but growing amongst the crops were these things called tares, which is an older term. It's like it looks just like wheat, but you can't tell the difference until the harvest comes." Right. So you're thinking, wow, I've got this great wheat crop, but half of it is made of weeds, but they look just like the wheat, the real wheat. So his servants, the farmer says, they ask him, should we go out and rip up all the weeds, you know? And he says, no, because that will tear up the good wheat in the process. So no, just wait until the harvest, cut everything down. The good stuff will separate out and we'll throw the weeds into the fire. You know, and this is exactly the theology that you just articulated, where Jesus basically says, there are people out there who look and sound just like real Christians. We don't know. I don't even know. He's, saying the difference between them until the judgment day, at which point the righteous are going to be separated into heaven. Theirs is going to be their rewards and for eternity and streets of gold and heavenly mansions and all that. The unrighteous, these people who are counterfeit Christians, are going to get thrown into the fires of hell. And we won't know until it's too late. You can't change it then. Once they've been cut down and separated, you can't go, wait, I was sorry. I got it wrong. I was liberal. I was just, listening to the liberal preacher. I made a huge mistake, as Job would say in Arrested Development. Yeah, I made a huge mistake. No, too late. It's too late. And there's a lot of parables where Jesus talks about that, where you don't know you're going to hell until you're standing in front of the judgment throne of God. And then he goes, depart from me. I never knew you. And they say, wait, we did all the things we prophesied. We led people to the Lord. We did all these things. No, you didn't do these things, X, Y, Z. You're going to hell.
Right.
So that theology is baked into Christianity. And the scary part is you don't know if you're one of them sheep or the goats in that parable. The goats end up getting sent to hell. The sheep get to go to heaven. You don't know until you're standing in front of the judgment throne. And then it's too late. So you got to live your life hoping that you're one of them sheep, and that every good thing you do is sending rewards up to heaven. Because of course, Jesus talks about, the left hand shouldn't know what the right hand's doing. So don't let people know what you're doing, but God sees what you're doing. That's what's significant. That's how you get rewards in heaven, is you do good things, in private, so to speak, without asking for an earthly reward. So this is a great way to keep followers compliant, isn't it? Just say, look, come help out around the church, do all these things in ministry. You're earning heavenly rewards. That's what it's about, and we don't know until we get there, and if it's all true or not. What a great system.
Well, exactly. It's another kind of double bind. I bring this term up repeatedly because it's an important term in psychology, because it is something that creates insanity. It creates a kind of thinking that is impossible because you have restrictions or rules or mandates, dogma, that are mutually exclusive things. They both can't be true at the same time, and yet they have to be true at the same time by the dictates of the group or religion or authority figure. And so, or parents or teachers or whoever's
Yeah.
giving
Whoever
you
it is.
your wife, right? I mean, they come from all over the place. But the more serious they are, the more that you feel that the consequences of that double bind are truly, fateful or eternal.
Yeah.
This can become a source of vast concern and anxiety, and it can even induce depression and terror and paranoia and all kinds of very, very, very aberrant behavior, you could say, like really crazy making stuff. These double binds are the heart and soul of it.
Yeah.
And I find them littered throughout cults in the same way thought stopping cliches are. They're just all over the place. And once you start looking for them, you see these landmines that are put into our heads as children. Um,
Hmm.
is where it really messes with our development, because we're stuck with these double binds. And here I'm thinking of the certainty of uncertainty, this
Mm.
this trap you're in that you just described so well, of never knowing whether that reward is coming your way or not, despite you thinking all the right thoughts and trying your best to do all the right things. So what is it that it's supposed to actually look like? What would the life of a perfect Christian that fits this dogma, what would it actually look like?
That's the thing, is nobody seems to have that quote unquote assurance of salvation. I can remember many times when I was a pastor in Portland, my parishioners would come to me, they'd have like appointments with me and they'd say, listen, I'm really struggling. I don't know if I'm really a Christian. And I know, talking to other people, Dr. Terry Daniel, she's a good friend of mine who lives in Portland, and she's a hospice worker. She deals with people as they're dying right toward the end of their life. And she says one of the most common things that I deal with as a hospice chaplain, as she's a secular atheist chaplain, but she has a lot of Christians, and on their deathbed, they are terrified that they're not going to get into heaven, and she's got to try to navigate through that difficult, circumstance. So she's not going to tear down their belief system, but it's got to be super tricky in a case like that. But they are terrified that, I've lived my whole life as a Christian, but now on my deathbed, I'm not sure if I'm going to get into those pearly gates. So it's a very difficult thing. Now there's a whole another thing we haven't talked about, and there's another sort of answer to this, and that is Calvinism. I'm sure you've come across John Calvin, but this is part of the Reformation. He came slightly after Martin Luther, but he developed a brand of theology that basically says, like, once saved, always saved. You are one of what he called the elect. God picked you before you were born, before the world was created, to go to heaven. And
That's
at
that
some
whole
point,
predestination
yeah,
thing, right?
you're
Yeah.
predestined for salvation, and it has nothing to do with anything you do. It's all based on God's foreknowledge and his own choice. Unfortunately, the flip side is there's a whole bunch of other people that didn't get picked, and they are going to go to hell. But they always say, well, you need to be thankful for the fact that God chose you. Don't worry about them burning in hell for eternity. So if you're one of them elect, you're okay. You're always going to be saved. So this is part of why I wrote the book, is to answer the charge people will say, you were never saved to begin with. You were never a true Christian. And I get into that toward the end of the book. I talk about Calvinism and how that would answer my story, and say, well, this is crazy because, like you say, it is a double bind. You're always worried about your salvation, but you're told, well, you're one of the elect. But then the question is, how do I know if I'm one of the elect? You don't know.
Exactly.
There's
Exactly.
always a loophole.
And it's always seems to be designed, and this is the trick, right? This is where I come, as a psych guy, I always look at this through that lens, and I'm always looking for the mental, bear traps, right? The things that are
Hmm.
gonna get you caught. Um, and you don't, anyway, and these double binds are that. You Going back to your parents for a second, because there was a question I thought I had about your parents, and I want to know what you thought about this. You described the misery of their relationship and how that began after they adopted Gothard's teachings. They were Christians, but then they became hardcore Christians under the Gothard,
Yeah.
umbrella of protection and all that. How did they get involved in Gothard's stuff, and what compelled them to stay in that, given how miserable both of them were, in addition to what they were doing to you kids.
Hmm. Yeah, from what I understand, I think it became a movement with our little church because I grew up in this Church of Christ. It was located, like I said, about 45 minutes south of Seattle. The best I can understand, I've asked my sister Valerie this a lot of times because when she comes over here to visit me, we go on these long trips and stuff. We spend hours in the car talking about all this stuff, trying to figure it out. How do they get involved in it? And she said some families started going and just started pushing his materials, and then, but it was a nationwide thing back in the late
Right.
60s, early 70s. He was huge. I mean, I don't know how many millions of people over the decades went to his seminars, but we used to go at the Seattle Center. When I turned 13, it's how old you had to be to start going. And I remember the Seattle Center was packed. There was probably 3, 4, 5,000 people, maybe more. I don't know, hanging on his every word. And he was offering solutions. And that's the thing, is that ironically, they were miserable because my mom confided in me a lot of really inappropriate stuff and how unhappy she was. And it's called emotional incest, and really fucked me up big time as a kid and destroyed my relationship with my dad, which I talk about in the book. But yet,
Mhm.
this idea is, if you do the right things, obey the Bible, do what God is telling you to do, you will be blessed. You will be happy. So they must have clung to this promise or promises that it's going to work out no matter how hard it is, no matter how tough it is. Even then, God is teaching you a lesson of faith. The struggles, the suffering are for your own good, you see, Chris. So even when it's tough, God is working in your life. And again, that goes back to a biblical metaphor. Jesus talks about in the Gospel of John that God is like a master gardener, and you're like a vine, a grapevine growing, and he's always cutting and pruning and slashing away things that are bad for you. And it hurts like hell, but you're going to come to thank him later when you see how good your life has become. So going through all those tough experiences, they must have told themselves, God, the master gardener, is coming through and he's cutting out these painful, horrible things, but it's for our own good. So it's another double bind, isn't it? The suffering becomes something to rejoice over. Be happy in your suffering. That's really fucked up. But most evangelicals, I'd say, have a very, very warped sense of it. It's like a theology of suffering. A case like Job in the Old Testament, he gets everything taken away from him, and his wife, tells him to curse God and die. And he says, "No, I can't do that. God's given me all this good stuff. I've got to praise him through the bad times." So he's a role model. And that's how we're supposed to respond when our lives go to shit. You're supposed to thank and praise God. But this is something that Dr. Marlene Winnell talks about. She says that for most evangelicals, their relationship with God is akin to an abusive partner who beats and smacks his partner around or her partner around, but yet demands blind obedience and love in return. And that's exactly the way my relationship with God was, as I saw it. Suffering and horrible things would happen to me, and yet I was supposed to love and serve and obey this same God that's inflicting all this stuff because it's for my own good. That's really messed up.
It's very messed up. And it
It is.
really was clarifying to me years and years ago when I saw that exact same thing, and almost word for word had the exact same idea. It hit
Hmm.
all of a sudden, wait a minute, these people are worshiping an abusive partner. The
Yeah.
way they interpret God, and I don't mean every Christian out there, because not all Christians think this way, but we're talking about the problematic ones today. We're talking about people whose faith is an excuse to beat on children and have miserable, horribly abusive lives of endless amounts of self-guilt and self-loathing and relationship distress and family dysfunction, social distress. I mean, it's so bad on every level. And you realize that the core value is worship of an abusive figure, of an abuser. And if
Hmm.
we don't tolerate that in human relationships, and we don't anymore, at least we're trying not to, we're pushing in that direction. Why, oh, why would we ever, want to or seek out that kind of relationship with our very creator? Is that
Yeah.
really the nature of the universe, that God is an abusive predator
Mm.
and he created us to abuse us? And I can't I can't reconcile myself to that view. And so I looked at the people who do, and I thought, there must be a massive amount of indoctrination happening from childhood forward to force this template of belief on people. And sure enough, you and every other evangelical I've talked with has proven that to be the case, that it demands years of beatings and abuse to get people into accepting this as their life view. That's pretty bad. That's pretty bad. And I'm wondering right now, is the Bible just a book that can be interpreted pretty much any way anybody wants to interpret it? I mean, is there a right answer here in this? Or, because I've read of Christians inside Christianity who look at Gothard stuff and go, he got it totally wrong. His interpretations are nuts. It never said that. So now you're a Bible expert. So this is why I feel so empowered to ask you these questions, right? Is this true? Is Gothard's stuff really off the rails, or is it just as valid an interpretation as the kinder, gentler interpretation? How am I to think about this as an outsider? I guess I'm asking you.
Exactly. And the thing is Gothard wasn't alone. You had guys like Dobson and Pearls and so many other pastors and leaders and influencers that pushed a similar message, and they're still doing it today. They're still pushing in a patriarchal system. Doug Wilson in Moscow, Idaho, he aligns with a lot of what Bill Gothard and Dobson would have said, so, and he's got a massive reach right now. He's huge in a lot of evangelical circles, so it's not anything that's gone away. It's funny because I was going back to your original point about abusive partner. It's baked into the Bible because I was an Old Testament scholar. That's what I used to teach and preach and all that. And I studied that for my doctorate. And I came to realize that the character God in the Old Testament is exactly that. He's got this relationship with the nation of Israel, his quote, chosen people, and they've got a covenant that they both agreed to. And in many cases in the Old Testament, it's portrayed as like a marriage. Israel is God's bride in a way. And all through the narrative of the Old Testament, there's this recurring theme, this idea that Israel's constantly going astray. They're always worshiping the false gods and the religions of the surrounding countries around them, and sinning and breaking the terms of the covenant. And what God does is his response is to send increasingly devastating punishments and plagues and everything else over and over until they repent and come back to him and worship him and serve him and go to the temple and do everything they're supposed to do. That's exactly the vision you just articulated. God is an abusive partner. Imagine being in that kind of a relationship with another person. Here's the terms of our covenant. If you break them, I will punish you. I will beat you in increasingly severe ways until you come crawling back and say you're sorry and you repent and start loving me and obeying me again. That's really messed up. But yeah, when I was a Bible.
We know that this is nothing but damaging and traumatizing to people.
Yeah.
So flipping the script on all of us traumatized people and saying that's the glory of God and that's what Jesus wants is a message of hate and terror. How does that make any sense? Yeah. I don't get it.
But going back to your other point, though, that you can interpret any passage in numerous ways.
Yeah.
I mean, you could go, and that's going back to my thing about multiple commentaries. I mean, I could pull out, let's say, 10 different commentaries on any book or passage of the Bible and give you 10 completely conflicting, points of view, anywhere from very liberal theology to super fundamentalist theology. It's funny because when I was doing my doctorate, speaking of Jonathan Edwards, I was studying the book of Ezekiel. And one of the chapters that I did, I compared 3 different sermons on the same passage. One was by Jonathan Edwards, one was by Charles Spurgeon, and the other was by Chuck Smith, who started the Calvary Fellowship movement in California. Again, hundreds of years apart, same exact passage, 3 completely different interpretations of the same passage. And it conflicted with the way I was interpreting it from how I studied it. So stalwarts of the faith, Jonathan Edwards, Charles Spurgeon, Chuck Smith, totally different interpretations, totally different emphasis on the same exact passage in the book of Ezekiel, which conflicted with my interpretation. So
right.
Who are you going to argue with? Spurgeon, Smith? I mean, who?
And that's really where the denominational thing comes into play. And we have thousands of different denominations of Christianity as a result of this.
Yeah.
But You gotta, I mean, just from, I hope the people who at least listen to the show or watching this in the future can see my dilemma here, right? If I wanted to, even if I wanted to enter into Christianity, which I don't, because I think this whole thing is a minefield of insanity with all these different interpretations.
I thought
But,
you were going to say you were about to get saved, Chris.
oh, yeah,
So
no,
I could
I'm
lead you
right
in the
to the
sinner's
edge,
prayer and
right?
everything.
Oh,
You're
so
that
close.
close.
But
So
if
close.
I did find it intriguing, and if I did find it something I wanted to pursue, the first barrier to entry for me is all the Christians telling me, no, that's not the right one. You got the wrong one. No, that's not the right. And I'm going to have,
We've got it right.
yeah, I'm going to have 800 people. I mean, how many denominations are there, right? I mean, I could have 800 people
Thousands.
tell me how wrong I am, while the one guy is over there going, no, no, we're right. We got it. We're the ones, right?
Yeah,
How am I supposed to decide? It's a little crazy making.
it is.
You wrote, um, the reality was that, quote, the reality was that my siblings and I lived in a dysfunctional, anxiety ridden, fear filled, hostile, and often unsafe environment. We were all required to act a prescribed and promised part for our church family. From the outside, our family appeared to be loving, godly, and wonderful, but that was far from the truth, especially for us kids. End quote.
Mm.
How, now that you've been out for years, you've been talking about this stuff. You were in it all the way in it. You're out all the way out. You've had years and decades of experience in this world of evangelical Christianity. How common is this attitude, this quote, across all of evangelical Christianity? How many families
Mm.
are making their own lives into a kind of hell on earth, trying to be good Christians by terrorizing their children, ignoring or abusing their spouses, hating themselves and everything about their lives? Because that's pretty much how you described it. Like,
Yeah.
how big of a problem is this?
I suspect it's pretty big. I mean, I can only speak from my own experience. I mean, I can't say all evangelicals are, having the same
Sure.
issue. Clearly, there are some, like you said before, not all Christians are the same. You can be a Trump MAGA fundamentalist, and you can be a super liberal universalist Christian. All Christian, everyone's going to heaven. Even you, Chris, you're going to heaven. I guess I am too. So that's a good news for us.
Definitely
But
universalist. I can agree with those guys.
yeah, but of course, other Christians call them heretics and everything else. But
Right.
I can remember, and I kind of wish I'd have put this in the book, but in my little Christian church in just south of Seattle, I can think of three concrete examples of families who looked great on the outside in church on Sunday every morning, went to summer camp and all the rest of it. My good friend, one of my good friends, his name was Eric. His father was physically and verbally abusive. I saw his father beating my friend Eric with a wire coat hanger over something. He failed to take his shoes off, and it was some trivial thing. And I was staying at his house for the night. And imagine that. Christian kids, I hear my friend screaming and crying, and I come rushing out of the bedroom and I look down. He didn't see that I saw him. He's whipping my friend with a wire because that's what he had in his hand at the minute. And obviously that happened quite a bit, and yet here they were every Sunday in church, beautiful, lovely family. And I know another family, his friend's name was Dean, and his father was physically abusive. And it was an open secret in the church that his dad beat Dean. And yet he was an elder in our church, his father, along with my dad. And the third example is my mom had a lifelong friend, and they were, I mean, super close, went out to lunch and had coffee and all that for 20 some years. They were close friends. It then transpired this friend of hers, she was married. She had been carrying on an affair with another married man for over 20 years. 20 years. They'd been carrying on an affair every Sunday. They're in church. This family looks so wonderful and great and shiny, happy people, and yet she had an affair with a married man for more than 2 decades. And I
Right.
think it finally came out and it all fell apart. But I mean, that's 20 years. That's to carry on an affair for that long, And so those are three examples from my church of probably 80 people. So you got to kind of extrapolate that out and say there's a lot of that going on. When I was a pastor, people did confess things to me. I mean, I had people that used to come to me for marriage counseling. They said all they all were doing is fighting and arguing and screaming at each other, and I would try to help them. So I know that kind of stuff was going on because I was privy to it as the counselor slash pastor. So, Christians struggled, and obviously my example of pastors addicted to pornography, God knows how many of them there are, and they're up every Sunday preaching, from the Bible, and yet hiding these secret lives. I mean, the pastor that baptized me, or what, he was the one who advised me to get baptized for the third time. He ended up being caught in, having an affair with the secretary, embezzling church funds, physically abusing his wife. This is the pastor of a church, that I was a member of for about 2 years. So, and look at all the scandals, man. I mean, how many pastors have been caught out abusing children and having affairs, and on and on and on. There's a laundry list, and it'll just keep growing.
Yeah, unfortunately, you're right. There's that old saying, men lead lives of quiet desperation. But I think to myself that it seems that evangelicals, and certainly many other denominations, many other religious groups, but we're picking on Christians today, lead lives of quiet hypocrisy is what it really seems to be. And I don't say this out of pure accusation. I'm trying to point out here, the purpose of my show is not just to be a snark fest. I know I get real super snarky about this stuff. Mostly that's coming from the fact that I have a lot of rage, real anger directed towards people who beat on kids. I have no tolerance for it at all, because I've seen the studies, I've read the research and the literature. This isn't just informed by my moral opinion, or I think it's not a good idea. It creates lifelong effects, and it can actually create a kind of psychosis in people if you beat on them hard enough, long enough. And you actually literally create a criminal. You create the exact thing you don't want.
Yeah, you're trying to stop, hopefully.
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
Allegedly,
Right.
ostensibly,
Yeah.
ironically.
Right? You want to beat somebody into being good, and instead you uniformly end up beating them into being somebody hateful, fearful, anxious, depressed, and somebody who is never, ever going to have a good, loving relationship with you as a parent.
Yeah. That's not what you want as a parent.
Exactly.
Everything. Not what I want as a parent.
Everything the opposite of everything you want. Exactly. And I get real, soapboxy about that. But I don't put on these shows or do these podcasts in an effort to just wag my finger. I even sit here and wag my finger sometimes. But I really am not trying to be like holier than thou in this approach. I'm trying to educate. I'm trying to show people that these are choices people make that they don't have to make. You don't have to do this with your kids. You don't have to do this to your family, and you don't have to do this to yourself. If you're in an evangelical cult out there, it's a cult just like Scientology. You can get out of it. You don't have to do this to yourself, and you don't have to have a miserable family life or social life of hypocritical fear and terror. It's not necessary that any of this be this way, in other words.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say
to people who about that.
Yeah. Going back to your earlier point I love that thing about the double bind. And that's obviously a cultic thing, but it's in Christianity. You've identified it many times in my own story. The answer in Christianity and evangelicalism is, okay, we understand you're going to struggle. You're going to have problems overcoming a life of sin. What you need to do is get involved in an accountability group. So you confess your sins, because that's what the Bible says, confess your sins to one another, and you will find forgiveness and healing and all that. Now that falls into, as I see it now, Lifton's two categories: the demand for purity, which is then followed by the cult of confession. And what Lifton says, and you know this already, that in groups like this, they put an impossible standard on the followers, the adherents, that they cannot live up to. Whatever biblical commands and demands you want to put in there, you can't do it. You inevitably fail. That's the demand for purity. Then the solution is confess your sins to one another, which is then a means of control, and it keeps you trapped on that treadmill of failure, confession, failure, confession, failure. So I would say to the typical evangelical, and I did this for years, I was in accountability groups. I was even in pastoral accountability groups, which is another level. We had to send each other emails, every week, and we had a checklist of all the things we were supposed to have done that week. And did you get a 10 out of 10 this week, or 7 out of 10, or 5 out of 10? No, I failed again this week, and please pray for me. And we'd meet every few months and, shame face and confess how how bad we were, and we're all pastors. you know, I
Wow.
don't know if I ever did 10 out of 10, maybe once in 6 or 8 months, and I finally quit because I thought this is just ridiculous. I can't do this. So yeah, that's the cultic psychology.
It unfortunately it really does fall into that area.
Hmm.
I don't want it to. I don't want religion to go bad, and all religion isn't bad. But when
Yeah.
when you take it to these levels and extremes and demand submission and and all this other stuff, and again beating on spouses, beating on kids, it's just a terror show. So Clint, I want to again remind everybody, Not So Shiny Happy People is the title of your book, right? And
Yeah.
where do people get it?
Yeah, I would say, or you can get it on Amazon. It's exclusively on Amazon, and that's the title is that if you've seen the series Shiny Happy People, which is all about the Duggars and Bill Gothard, that's why you need to get this book because it's all about being raised in this same kind of environment and the actual impact that it does. But it's called Not So Shiny, Not So Happy People: How Bill Gothard Church and Family Taught Me Christianity Doesn't Work. So you can find it. It's available as a paperback, as a Kindle, and now it's available as a virtual voice AI version, which actually I've just started listening to. It's in the beta testing phase now, but you think it's going to be a robot reading your book. You cannot tell that it's not a human being reading this book. There's a couple things where the voice kind of says something not quite the way you or I would say it, but we had to get it out there as an audio book, I think, along with the other one. So I'm working on I'm doing my own narration, which I think we talked about before. It's something I will do, but it takes a lot of time, doesn't it? But for now, you can get it in all three versions on Amazon.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I'm really glad you got an audio version out there because yeah, people
Hmm.
will consume these books audio wise faster and easier than they'll read. But either way, again, I can't recommend it enough. I really hope you guys will check it out. I'm going to link to it below here. And then if people wanted to reach out to you, how would they do so?
Okay, well, I run a podcast. It's called the Dismantling Doctrine Podcast. And in fact, talking about my book, I've just done 2 episodes. I read actually the preface chapter. That was a couple weeks ago. I don't know when this episode's going to come out, but on the 11th of September when the book was launched. And then as of today, on the 18th of September, as we're doing this recording, I've had another episode where my editor, Tim Sledge, actually interviewed me about the book. And we get into a lot of more Christian theology, even though you and I did. So that's another episode. But you can find me on X at Mindship 2018. You can find me. There's a public Dismantling Doctrine Facebook page. There's even a public Not So Shiny, Not So Happy People Facebook page if you want to connect with me and talk about the book itself. So there's a lot of different ways you can get a hold of me on social media.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to do my best to put links to all of those things in the show notes here so y'all can reach out to Dr. Clint Heacock.
Thank
Truly
you.
a religious expert, by the way. This is not just a sad story.
I'm just blowing smoke.
I should have led with that, but I'm just telling you guys, this guy
Damn
knows
it, it's too late.
about. So, so
I was a pastor and Bible college teacher for about 20 years. I mean, yeah, I've taught it, preached it, lived it. So yeah, it's not skin deep for sure.
exactly. That's why I love talking to you about this stuff. Because you have walked the walk and talked the talk and done all of
Yeah.
it, and then walked right the hell away from it. And just like me with
Yeah.
Scientology, good on you. There is no reason, just so I want to wrap up by saying this. Because again, I get snarky, but that's really not what this is about. I want you all to know that there is life beyond these cults, that there is something better for you. If you are trapped or stuck or feel like you're on a hamster wheel to nowhere in your religion or in your group, you can get off of there. As unlikely, as difficult, as weird, or impossible as it might seem to you right now, if you want to change your life and you are not happy with how things are because of the groups you're part of or the relationships you're in, change is possible. And if you're listening to this show, you must have some spark of believing that. So yes, it is true, and we can help with that. So you can contact Clint, you can contact me, we can give you some direction and advice from our own experience and knowledge about this stuff. And I wanted to put that out there for the audience because I don't want this to just be something that people listen to and laugh and point at and go, "Oh, those horrible people." I want to get people out of those situations, and I think putting some hope out there will hopefully
Yeah.
do that.
It's
So
true.
Clint,
I would say, just to add
mhm,
to that, my
yeah,
story, I think, is really ultimately about recovering and finding my authentic self, my authentic identity. And every time I had a question or a doubt, and all those decades of serving God and being a Christian and all that, that was actually my authentic self trying to make itself heard. So if you're listening, watching this and saying, yeah, I do have questions and doubts about my belief system, whatever it might be, that's actually your authentic self. You need to follow that path. And like you said, Chris and I can turn you on to resources and education and say, this is how you do it. However, you do that. It's different for everybody, but yeah, it can be done. We're living proof of that, I think.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. All right. Thanks again, Clint, for taking some time today and sharing all these thoughts with me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Chris. We'll have you on my show soon. We need to do something. Yeah, we need to do an update, certainly on Project 2025, what you've learned about it. So I'll be tapping you soon.
Absolutely. I'm down, man. All right, good. All right, folks. Check it out. Check out Clint's podcast as well. And I will see you guys next week. Bye bye.